the first webinar of Social Value Live, our online event that's happening today and tomorrow. I'm Chloe McCulloch. I'm editorial director at Building, and this webinar asks the question, how the 15-minute city can create a more socially valuable built environment. On our panel today, we have Rebecca Dillon Robinson, Senior Urban Planner at Ramboll, who you can see on your screens here with me. We are also expecting David Rudlin, who is Head of Urban Design at BDP, and also one of our regular columnists on building design, one of our publications. So he's unfortunately having a few technical issues joining us today, but we hope he will be able to join us later. So I'm going to get things started with just a quick introduction, and then we will move on to Rebecca's presentation. So before all of that, I should just let you know the format. This is an hour-long webinar. You can post questions at any time throughout the hour, and as we have a lot of people attending the session, we will save those questions for the end and try to get through as many as we can. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on demand on our website, building.co.uk. So just to get back to our actual topic, we are discussing the 15-minute city concept, and how that brings benefits to communities and how we should go about designing and building them. In a very simplistic overview, the concept is that we should be creating places where essential services and amenities, including housing, work, education, healthcare, leisure, all of those things are within 15 minutes of a walk or a cycle ride. So active travel is a big part of this, and reducing car dependency is a key element. David actually talks about some of this in a recent column for Building Design. I recommend you read it. And he talks about the concept being credited to Professor Carlos Moreno at the Sorbonne University, who's also a special advisor to the mayor of Paris. And I think there's been quite a lot of work done in Paris around this concept. However, it's not without its critics. I think you will have seen debates about initiatives such as the Oxford's low traffic neighbourhoods, and those conversations tend to blow up on social media and become rows. I think there's also been a lot of controversy around a Conservative MP who referenced some conspiracy theories in Parliament. So I think the 15-minute city has got caught up in all of that. But today is really about presentations talking about how you make this work in principle, in terms of and in practice, in terms of built environment professionals, what they need to know, and the complexities of it, because it shouldn't really become dominated by a polarized debate. So that's where we're going to go today, I think, and we will start off first with Rebecca. And Rebecca, I think you've done some interesting work in Scotland, which you're going to talk to us about. I think actually you refer to it as 20-minute neighbourhoods. So I'm not going to quibble over 5 minutes here or there. We're talking about the same concept, really, aren't we?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Chloe. And I will start sharing my screen and let you know what we have been working on.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my camera and I'll just let you know when I can see your presentation come up. Okay, I think that does look like it's in presentation mode, so thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation to the discussion this morning. So as Chloe said, I'm Rebecca Dillon Robinson, and I'm a senior urban planner in the Regenerative Cities team at Ramboll. And our team's focus is about enabling resilient community development by creating a healthy, happy and inspiring built environment, and 20-minute neighbourhoods, 15-minute cities form a key part of this. So I'm sorry, just lost my place there. So who is Ramboll? So we are a global foundation-owned architecture, engineering and consultancy company with 17,000 experts worldwide. And we provide standalone and multidisciplinary advice to clients and cities throughout the built and natural environment. And I think when looking at this concept, that puts us in a really good place to take learnings from other global places that have been working towards a transition towards livability, such as Copenhagen. For a long time, and so we're able to take some of those learnings and then reflect some of that in our work across in the UK, and kind of share those learnings. So as Chloe referred to, we have in particular been supporting national and local authorities in Scotland to develop an understanding of this concept. They call it the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, but also then think about what implementation means, both in policy, but also in practice. And so that's what I'm going to take you through. I'm going to take you through an understanding of why we're doing this, the kind of big global picture, how this has then been aligned to kind of policy frameworks in Scotland with a particular focus on driving those outcomes that we know are so important when we think about social value and social impact. And then I'm going to take you a little bit through what does this look like when we then go into the built environment and start implementing some of this thinking. So Chloe gave you a kind of broad definition. We work to a slightly different definition. So for this approach to create valuable places, it really needs to be tailored to the needs of the place and the communities who live there. So when we then think about this on the ground, we think different people have different needs on the ground. If you're in a city versus a rural environment, you're going to want different things and to be able to move in different ways in a rural environment. And really, you know, I'm bringing this understanding from a national Scottish perspective. So a kind of a small island in Scotland is very different to a city centre. Also, through age, we need different things, and we need different access. So we also really want to focus on the outcome. I think a lot of the debate, which we might get into later, has been a real focus on just living locally without the idea of why do we want to live locally. And for us, that's about well-being. And so we use the term living well locally. And so that has kind of resulted in a definition that we use in our work, which is about enabling everyone. So that's that inclusive piece, to live well locally. So that's about kind of improving standards, quality of life, and accessing their daily needs in an active or sustainable way. And so what we would do is we take this approach and then tailor it to specific places, which I'll take you through in the presentation. So I guess kind of zooming out, really back out again to the bigger picture. Why are we bothering? Why do we need to do this? And so we know that a lot of the debate has focused around kind of climate action and decarbonisation, but there are other things that we need to think about around climate resilience, biodiversity loss, and poverty. So a lot of this concept is also thinking about the just transition as well. And I think, you know, in our work, we're really looking at it from a really inclusive point of view, but also with an understanding that it sits in this much bigger global context. And so we can't just think about the neighborhood scale. We've got to think about how that neighborhood fits into the much wider and complex urban systems, which also involve all of these other aspects. And alongside this, we also know that by 2050, we're going to have a much higher proportion of people living in cities worldwide. So although we might look at this concept in a rural situation, we know that cities in particular are going to be facing a lot of these really big global challenges. That's the big picture. So I'm now going to talk about our work, particularly in Scotland, and why the Scottish Government in particular are really interested in this concept, and it's become really embedded in a lot of their policy. So for Scotland, it's part of the tackling the climate emergency by reducing car dependency, and they had a target of reducing private vehicle dependency by 20%. It's also about tackling inequality by improving access to services and service provision. And for Scotland, Scotland has real public health inequalities. And so Public Health Scotland see this concept as a real driver for improving public health outcomes by facilitating access to active travel. And I think, you know, the exciting thing is that it offers this really coordinated approach of thinking across policy and thinking about place at the centre of that, and the place and the outcomes for place being really important and driving all of these cross-policy outcomes. So let's kind of dive into then what the concept kind of starts to mean when we unpick it. So for me, when we're looking at a 20-minute neighbourhood, 15-minute city, we need to think about it, start to measure it, and we need to start to implement it on 3 levels. And the first level are features and infrastructure. So the things that we have in place that need to be within a reasonable distance of people's homes. So the parks, the footpaths, the shops. Secondly, these features need to have a certain level of quality to them. The parks being well maintained, everyone feeling safe to walk along the footpaths, or being able to access and buy fresh fruit and vegetables from the shops. So that's that quality element that's really important. And thirdly, we need to think about engagement and behaviour change. Well, we need to think about how we involve communities in the way that their places are designed, so that the places and the interventions that we do meet those needs of that community. And if that community is involved in deciding what those needs are and then looking at the interventions, they're much more likely to make changes to move more actively in their neighbourhood. So when all of these 3 things come together, then we have a place performing as a 20-minute neighbourhood. So how do we go about measuring this, and how do we go about kind of embedding this and pushing for these outcomes? From a kind of, again, national perspective, what we have been supporting the Scottish Government to do is to look at how they embed all of those great outcomes that they talked about improving public health and reducing private vehicle demand in a kind of outcomes framework or policy framework. So in Scotland, they have the obviously internationally, we think about the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, there are 17 of those goals that countries across the world have signed up to and agreed to work towards. That's the kind of national picture, that wider picture that I was talking about. If we then come into a national level, Scotland then has particular challenges aligned to those international goals. But as I said before, particularly around public health inequality, that's a really big challenge for Scotland. So they have what are called the National Performance Framework Indicators, and they set out performance targets for Scotland, which can then be kind of followed up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals to show how they're meeting those as well. Now we kind of zoom down. Scotland then has a real focus on place and outcomes that they want for places, which are called the place and wellbeing outcomes. And these are 5 themes that enable local authorities, local communities, place practitioners to take a really joined up approach to creating positive outcomes for place. And again, they link back up to that national performance framework. When we're then thinking about neighbourhoods and the detail of places, there's something called the place principle or the place standard. And although this was developed in Scotland, it is applicable nationally. It is applicable in other places apart from Scotland and where it's being used nationally. And this breaks down those place and wellbeing outcomes into 14 categories, which take a really holistic view of place. And so you can see, if we think about the real detail of place, we can kind of track outcomes through this whole scale. So I'm going to kind of dive in a little bit to the place standard and the kind of things that we look at when we are assessing place from this holistic point of view. So, Chloe mentioned a lot of the typical things that we might think about when we think about a 15-minute neighbourhood. Think about the facilities and services, shopping, education, restaurants, cafes. But when we think about place more holistically, we think about some of the other aspects that are really important to creating complete places: feeling safe, identity and belonging, care and maintenance, influence and sense of control. Are you able to be involved in local politics, for example? And then other things that we know that are essential to the 20-minute neighbourhood: moving around, safe cycling, walkability, but also that wider connection to the wider city, so connection to public transport. And in some places, public transport might form a key part of a neighbourhood strategy, particularly in a rural community. So when we're looking at kind of understanding place, gathering data, gathering an understanding of place, we look across all of these categories. And importantly, we look at the quantity features. So are these things present, but then also the quality indicators that they have. And we can gather data around that and also work with the community to develop an understanding of the situation in place. And this is a great framework for place, but it's really important to note that when we're looking at different places, we need to be able to make it bespoke to those places. So actually, in this example, we were working with a local authority where libraries were a really key driver for movement. So library has been selected as its own subcategory for them to particularly focus on. So what can we do with all of this? So what we have done is we've gathered data across those multiple categories, those 14 categories, so for quantitative and qualitative indicators. And for a couple of clients, we have put this into a bespoke online tool that assesses places against that framework, and then assesses walkability across every neighbourhood in a city or a region. And allows our local authorities to, again, take that really holistic view of place, work across policy boundaries and find the gaps in place that they can then target. Kind of another aspect that we might think about how we make sure that we're actioning all this great work that we might be doing when we look at then a strategy to assess those gaps is how do we monitor change over time? And again, this tool and this approach allows us to monitor change over time. One of the other things that we've seen when doing this process is that there are gaps in the data, particularly in quality data. And this process really supports our clients to find those gaps and then to go out and find different ways to get that information so that they can get a much richer picture of place. So we've kind of taken that like baselining approach to place. We know how we're going to monitor and evaluate it. So how do we go about filling those gaps that we found across a city or a region, and then looking at intervention design? And so for us, it's really important that to avoid some of the risks that this concept poses, which I think we're going to be discussing a bit, what we need to do is take this multi-scale approach. So we need to think about the impacts at the city scale, the impacts at the regional scale, then think about the neighbourhood and the district, or it might be a site that's being developed where we look at a particular intervention. And then we also zoom in on the impacts on people and community. And it's really important that we're working across those scales at all times when we're thinking about the neighbourhood. Okay, so I'm just going to talk. I hope I'm still on time. I've still got a bit of time to talk about this. But I was just going to talk a little bit about one of the projects where we've kind of implemented this approach. So this is some work with a local authority in Dublin, and they came to us to look at an active mobility strategy and to think about providing inclusive movement for school children, and they had funding from Active Mobility. So the thing that we were able to do was to work with them to look at all of the drivers to active mobility and to help them to understand that some of those drivers are infrastructural, but some of those drivers are not infrastructural as well. So it might be about barriers to participation for women because they didn't feel safe, or they didn't feel that they had access, or people didn't feel that they had access to the right bikes, for example, or to safe cycle storage. So we were able to look across the whole network, understand the different neighborhoods that this kind of system was linking up, and particular drivers to school, and then take really targeted interventions to link this whole network up, and particularly provide movement for the most vulnerable across this area. And alongside doing those kind of very focused interventions on active mobility, because we were taking this strategic approach, we were also able to look at other factors like biodiversity corridors. So if we're building a cycleway, where can we also then look at those biodiversity connections? And I talked about engagement and being really important when we action this. So what we did a lot in that intervention design was about co-design, working with communities. Where can we make these interventions bespoke to the needs that are about active mobility, but might be about other things? So, for example, there was a park on the top of a hill, and some of the elderly population was struggling to walk up to that hill. So we put a bench alongside a cycleway so that they could sit and access and move up to that park. And then, a lot of this concept is also about then strengthening or making local economies more resilient, so local places more resilient. And so that was that's another aspect that was really important to understand, where those local drivers to movement are, where those town centres or village centres are, and how we can drive active movement to those town and village centres. And so this is an image kind of looking down on one of those town and village centres. And so what we worked to do was this project was over COVID. So we did a temporary project that allowed more people to walk along the street. You can see to the left-hand side of the image. So that was a temporary intervention during COVID when people couldn't go into the shops. It allowed more people to walk and cycle there. And there's lots of evidence that show that if people walk to places, they're more likely to spend money. So that was a really interesting intervention. And alongside that, we were able to implement some of the other things around biodiversity as well. So yeah, thank you very much. And looking forward to the debate.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think we might have David Rudlin joining us now. Wonderful. David, I know you've had some technical problems. We've just literally got to the end of Rebecca's presentation, so I will let you find your feet. I've just got a couple of follow-up questions for Rebecca because it was such an interesting presentation, but I can see you here on our screen, so it's lovely to have you with us.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, look, Rebecca, there was so much there, and I'm sure we'll get questions about it, but I found that place standard really interesting. I confess I didn't know about it. Could you just recap where that comes from? It's not just a Scottish thing, is it?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. So it was developed by the Scottish government.
Oh, it is. Okay.
So the place standard, it's about looking at place across all of the different characteristics that we think about. So what I said kind of services, but also things like identity and belonging. And they developed this really collaboratively across policy areas and across different people working in place. And what it's being used for. So it's a kind of principle or a framework, but one of the uses is to take it out to communities, and this is where it's actually being actioned worldwide, and to help people have a conversation about place. And because you can go through all of those different categories, and it's quite accessible, and the language that's used is quite accessible, then communities can kind of drive what's the most important aspect in their places. And yeah, there's a tool that can be used for that. But I think, you know, when we were then looking at the work on what's a 20-minute neighbourhood in Scotland, we really wanted to make sure that we aligned to that existing framework so that you can kind of support communities to have a conversation about place, but when we're also understanding the data, it's aligned.
Yeah.
I hope that answers
no, it came across as we've actually got one specific question already about it, and it's more about maybe there's something that it doesn't have, but maybe that shouldn't come across in the list. We've got Colin asking a question about, is there any reference within the place standard to local energy facilities or provision? So I guess that's around the net zero agenda, and maybe that's more specific to particular places where that would be relevant.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I know that they are developing a climate focused place standard, but I guess, you know, as I said, with our approach, we understand that the neighborhood isn't the only thing happening in a city, that it's really important that we look across all of the other systems in a city. And so energy or district energy is a really important part of that. And so, yeah, this kind of lens or this concept isn't a panacea. We need to situate it in everything else that we think about in the city. But I do think it's a really interesting point, and that kind of localized energy production.
Brilliant. Well, look, there's loads more that I want to come back on, especially around that accessibility sort of online tool that you mentioned that Ramboll's been using. So that's interesting as well. But for now, I think we'll go across to David, and so he can share his thoughts on this topic. David, do you have slides to share? Do you want to?
I'm going to try and share. Everything's gone wrong this morning, so I'm losing confidence in my ability to do anything here.
It can only get better, I think.
It can only get better.
Okay, well, let's give it a go. Rebecca and I will turn off our cameras, and I will just say out loud if I can see your slides or not. If not, we have a backup system, I think.
So I'm sharing my PowerPoint, and it's saying, oh, just a second. It's saying it's failed. Really, everything has gone wrong this morning. It is extraordinary how.
Oh, sometimes it's that way, isn't it?
Morning. So I'm going to share screen. So if I do that, are you seeing my screen now?
There can be a bit of a delay. So hold on one second. It's not going. So I might see if we've got Celine in the background helping us with technical aspects.
I've been trying to send Celine the slides, and that hasn't worked either.
Okay. We might have to go without the slides, and you talk us through your thoughts. I'm sure they'll be fine.
So yeah, sorry about this. I was going to do this without slides anyway, so I'll do it. I'll do it so I can see the slides, and then I can structure what I'm talking that way. So what I was going to talk about, and it's a shame I just missed the previous speaker. I wanted to just sound a few notes of caution really about 15-minute cities. I think I'm an urban designer, so for years we've been talking about mixed-use, walkable neighbourhoods, and in a sense, 15-minute cities are just that. And so, what is not to like in terms of the idea behind 15-minute cities is very much the sort of thing that we have been promoting right the way through our careers. But what's happened, I think, is that it's come to fruition, particularly during lockdown and through the work of Carlos Moreno in Paris. And it has this, it's basically the walkable city with a sort of dash of COVID and working from home. So it's been given that slant, and I think it's therefore got an awful lot of traction because of that whole process. A few years ago, we had Carlos Moreno speak at the Academy of Urbanism Congress, and he talked about a whole range of things in terms of the initial concept, which was much more than just this idea of being able to walk to everything within 15 minutes. He talked about things like chronourbanism and this idea of enjoying the city and taking life a little bit more slowly and enjoying the spending time in streets and cafes and being free of traffic and so on. And it seemed to be something which was slightly wider than the way it's been picked up by a lot of people in the field. And it seems to me also that it's not the first time this has been done. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the 1990s promoting a thing called the Sustainable Urban Neighbourhood, or SUN, which it seemed to me was actually very similar in some respects. It was talking about making cities more sustainable by reducing the need for travel and looking at mixed-use districts and so on. In America, you had the pedestrian pocket movement, if you may recall, people like Peter Calthorpe, and talking about high accessibility zones and looking at creating dense neighbourhoods around transit stops and so on. You've also got transit-oriented development, or TOD, which is something which I come across all over the world in terms of people promoting what they take, but it tends to translate as is very high density development around transit stops, particularly in suburban areas of larger cities. And again, these are all essentially the same thing. And the final one I'd add to the list really is garden cities. And a few years ago, we were involved in the Wolfson Prize, and that was for neighbourhoods of 800 metres, which is a 10-minute walk zone rather than 15, and looked at how you could create new garden cities so everyone was in a 10-minute walk of a transit stop and a local centre. So in a sense, that's nothing new, and it's all sort of motherhood and apple pie. So what's therefore surprising, I think, and I've got a quote on the screen which you can't see, from Conservative MP Nick Fletcher, who some of you will know is the sort of red wall Conservative MP, who comes out with all sorts of comments, and he called 15-minute cities an international socialist conspiracy, and you think, what on earth is going on here? And you may have come across, I think, the huge protests that are happening in Oxford at the moment. And for those of you who don't know, what's happening in Oxford, three things are happening. First of all, they're looking to develop low traffic neighbourhoods in certain neighbourhoods. Secondly, they're sort of branding this as 15-minute cities. And thirdly, they have a proposal to create gates on the roads into the digital gates, camera gates on the roads into the city centre. The idea being that you won't drive from one neighbourhood of Oxford to another neighbourhood through the city centre. You've got to go around the ring road, which is all perfectly reasonable. But I'm looking at a slide which I'd be showing of protesters calling it 15-minute prison cities, and people saying, oh, we won't be allowed to leave there's cameras on the gates of our 15-minute neighbourhoods, and we won't be allowed to leave, and we'll need to apply for permission. Absolutely ridiculous stuff going on in terms of the conspiracy theories which are growing up around this. And it's extraordinary, it seems, that this has sort of got so out of hand. And it's sort of happening in many fields of life at the moment, that conspiracy theories, lockdowns and COVID, and have sort of developed this whole conspiracy theory thing. But people are just picking up on things and getting angry about things which bear no relationship at all to reality. And I think what's happened when you mess with people's right to use and park their car where you like it gets people really cross. And so I've been writing about 15-minute cities for quite a while now, and expressing some sort of mild concerns about them, and low traffic neighbourhoods. And all of a sudden, I feel like it's not the sort of company that I want to keep. But nevertheless, what I've got here is just to finish off this in the 10 minutes I've got here, is just to raise a few of the issues which I have about these things, and about 15-minute cities, and the way they become such a sort of bandwagon, in a sense, in terms of the way that people are picking these up. And the first is that there's sort of the statement of the obvious. I think the data from London shows that most people do most of the things they need to do in their life within 15 minutes of where they live. In other words, in the big cities, it's already pretty much the way things work. The difference, the thing that people didn't do within 15 minutes of where they live historically was work, because they get the tube and go into the centre or to other parts of London to work. With working from home, obviously that's also changed. And so I think there's a sense in which, and this is quite a French thing to do, to sort of create an over intellectualized sort of statement of the obvious, which is what, in a sense, Carlos Moreno did, packaged up a whole bunch of things which were already happening and gave it a title which people picked up on. So that's the first concern. The second concern, which is actually quite a big issue in Paris, is that it's socially divisive. That this idea that people live within their nice middle class 15-minute cities, and they can get everything they like. They've got their coffee shops and so on, and they have no traffic going through. And actually, the rest of the population are stuck in banlieues on the edge, which are certainly not 15-minute cities at all. And the traffic gets dumped onto them and so on. And so there is a slight concern that this is something this is a sort of part of the gentrification of cities, and actually what it isn't doing necessarily is picking up on the needs of the whole community. And there has been quite a lot of research about low traffic neighbourhoods and the impact that they have on traffic and potentially the diversion of traffic into other areas. And I think that research, to be fair, is probably inconclusive. Some studies show that there's very little impact, and others show that there is some impact. So I think there's a question mark about this, but I think there is a potential concern there. Bigger concern, I think, what's the other thing that's happening in Oxford is you can't take a single-use suburb with very little facilities within it and call it a 15-minute city. Because if you don't have the facilities to reach within a 15-minute walk, then what is it you're actually saying? And I think this is one of the problems, that 15-minute cities either already exist in places like London and the larger cities, in which case we've already got them, or in places where we don't have that mix of uses and local facilities, they don't exist, and just calling things 15-minute cities isn't going to help them to exist. And so, yes, and what's happened in places like Oxford is that the starting point has been to reduce the freedom to use the car, but actually what hasn't been provided is the local shops and bakeries and cafes and all the other facilities that you'd need in order to make things a 15-minute city. So I think one has to be a little bit cautious about just using it as a sort of headline without understanding what it is, what it means in practice, which is wholesale transformation of our urban fabric, is what 15-minute cities imply. And unless you do that, then actually, well, I'm not sure how meaningful it is. Concern 4, and this goes back to the lockdown period, is that 15-minute cities were initially meant to avoid the use of public transport. And so this idea that people could live and work within a 15-minute walk of their home, and therefore they weren't having to risk social distancing on public transport. That was obviously an issue for COVID. It's not an issue anymore. And I think public transport is absolutely crucial. And I think there is nothing wrong with living within a 15-minute city, but that 15 minutes being your tram ride. And so when we did the Wolfson Prize, we talked about everywhere being within a 20-minute tram ride of where you lived, and so that's the whole city, not just your neighbourhood. And so I think we need to not I think that these things forego the need for investment in public transport. I think that is a crucial part of living in a city, and just walkable neighbourhoods are not enough. You need the city, and that brings me to my 5th concern, really, which is about the city. So there's lots of things that we love about cities that you can't do within 15-minute neighborhoods. You can't do art galleries, you probably can't do cinemas, you can't do concerts, you can't do football stadiums, you can't do all the things which we love and thrive in a city. You can't have a media industry. You can't do creative industries. You can't do a lot of the economic things in cities within just a single neighbourhood. And cities work because of economies of scale, and those economies of scale are measured in the millions of people rather than the people in the neighbourhood. And so 50-minute cities are not an alternative to living in a big city. I think cities are something which are very important to us in terms of both society and economy. And 50-minute cities have to be seen as part of that. They're certainly not an alternative to it. And again, I may be putting up straw dogs here because people are not really thinking in this way. But if you go back to what Carlos Moreno talked about in 50-minute cities, it was very much this, that the neighborhood became the main thing, and the bigger city became secondary to the neighborhood. And I think that's worrying. What I think we need to do is to look at the transit orientated city, which is people living within a 15-minute, or I'd say probably a 10-minute walk of transit stops, and those transit stops then being 20 minutes into the city centre, and then people being able to live in a sustainable way in a big city, also within their neighbourhood. And that's where I think we should be going. And I'm coming to an end now, but I'm sorry I couldn't show my slides. It was a generally way of me helping me structure what I was saying anyway. So thank you for that. I'll draw it to a close there.
Thank you so much, David. I'll just turn my camera back on. And if you're happy to, we can always share your slides with the audience after this. So they will still sort of see your visualization of your thought process as well, if you're happy to share them. But no, I thought that was really fascinating. I'll invite Rebecca back on, actually, for this bit at the end. But I think in my introduction, I made reference to your article, David, and some of the topics that you touched on. And I think talking to Rebecca as well, I think there's some really interesting issues we could try to unpick a little bit here. I think one thing that we were talking about was the difference within this debate of talking around transport infrastructure and the need, as you're saying, David, to think about good investment in infrastructure. But then secondly, I think Rebecca wanted to emphasize, obviously that's important as well, to connect people and places to services. But there's also this issue around community well-being, I think, that you wanted to highlight, Rebecca, and how do you measure that? Because that's the slightly harder thing. To, communities can point to missing infrastructure and they can lobby for it, and they can, local MPs can say that they need it, and there'll be lots of data to back up that sort of thing. But how do you actually look at community well-being and measure that and make demands for communities based on what is missing, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think this comes back to the one of the reasons why we want to look at improvements in the local area. And David, I completely take the points that you were making, and I think I was reiterating them earlier, but this is one piece of the city. This is not the whole solution. But if we kind of zoom into the neighborhood level, for me, it's not just about living locally, it's about living well locally. How are we going to persuade people to walk more actively to their daily needs and daily services if they're not getting a kind of a better outcome from it? And then bringing it back to that kind of inclusivity point as well, when we're asking people to make changes in their lives, we've got to look across all parts of the city and make sure that we are looking equally across neighborhoods. Again, David, you talked about kind of the risks of gentrification and ghettoization. We've got to look at kind of community well-being across all places and driving that kind of quality of life forward. So how might we go about understanding what that is and measuring what that is? Well, well-being's an interesting topic because you can look at kind of some more quantitative measures and some more qualitative measures to understand it. But a lot of it will be driven by the specific needs of the community. So the first starting point is going to be really meaningful engagement, understanding where the community are and where they want to be, and kind of building a framework that helps you get there. Now, there are some kind of indicator frameworks that we can use. And I talked about the kind of place standards framework. It's not necessarily a community wellbeing framework, but it can be helpful to kind of structure that conversation about place. So I think, it's really, why are we making these changes, and what do the community want as an outcome at the end, and really building a framework around that.
And David, do you think that's partly where the debate has got polarized sort of on social media, is because communities haven't felt that they've been consulted with this, that we've started with the stick, which is reduce your car dependency, without actually finding out what the communities are wanting and then getting there gradually, because surely it can't all happen at once. You have to start somewhere.
I mean, a couple of years ago, we wrote the Quality of Life Foundation's framework, and so that talks about all these things about what a good neighbourhood looks like, and how social well-being is created in a neighbourhood. And I think if you have neighbourhoods where those things have been provided, then the 15-minute city happens by default, because that's how people live their lives in those neighbourhoods, because they have the local facilities. I think, as you're right, absolutely right, Chloe, that what's happened is that we've started with the stick. We've said we need to stop you travelling by car quite so much, and so on. And before we've actually created those fantastic communities, which we've all been working all our careers to try and create. I mean, we want to create these good communities, but in a sense, you can't start by just designating a 15-minute neighbourhood in an area which isn't one of those communities. And there are lots of deprived communities where those things aren't in place, but also a lot of the new housing estates and suburbs that we've created, they're not in place either. So it's a lot of work to actually turn a out of town housing estate into something which could be a 15-minute city, and that's what we should be doing. Absolutely, I agree. But just starting with the car thing, it is getting people angry, I'm afraid. And I think it's really counterproductive. I mean, I feel like a lifetime's work of sort of, working on transport and urbanism and so on is potentially being undone by this debate that's become so toxic at the moment about these things.
I'm just going to go back to Rebecca and the work that she's been doing in Scotland. I mean, do you feel like that's been, how has that been done differently to, say, where we've seen some areas of controversy? Do you see successes where you've worked with neighbourhoods in it and that consultation process has worked? And has that been in existing communities where you've tried to sort of retrofit it in, or has that been in new master plans? How's that been different?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to this much more kind of holistic approach, and really focusing on outcomes and then bespoke to place. That's the really important thing. Working in Scotland, communities are really, really varied, and that's one of the challenges of looking at this on a national scale. But I'll take an example of kind of a really rural neighbourhood in the Shetland Islands. So thinking about that community is very, very different to a city centre, and the expectations of that community, the needs and the wants are also very different to what they would expect to access within a city centre. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to have a good quality of life, and to be able to access things safely, and for everybody to be able to access them. So one of the really interesting things in Shetland and in kind of crofting communities, I know we're kind of talking about cities, but I thought this acts as an interesting counterpoint, is that road widths are really, really narrow because they're in a natural environment. And so actually providing a safe walkable footpath alongside the space where a car goes is really difficult. So what you would look at in that situation is actually more of a kind of potentially educational program, or understanding of how people are kind of driving, and then sort of a safety piece, and some of that might be about lighting, principles along those kind of rural footpaths, for example. Some of it might be about kind of cycle training programs to provide people kind of access to bikes and kind of a feeling of safety. So, and then what the community are going to access in those rural areas might be very different to a city. So I think one of the things that is being looked at in different places, we talk about service access, is a lot of bank branches are closing down. Well, people still need access to banking. A lot of us do it online, but that's not accessible for everybody. Not everybody accesses banking via their phone or can. So banks are looking at one building where multiple branches come in once a week and share the access. So I think, when we're looking at assets, and particularly kind of constrained places, maybe in rural communities, but increasingly across different places, how can we use those assets cleverly for multiple uses? And that could be, multiple banks, but it also could be, a GP surgery in a community centre, for example.
Yeah, I think that makes it really concrete, actually, what we can be talking about and the specificity of different places. David, we've got a question. We've got lots of questions coming in, actually, but one is around, I don't know if you can speak to this question, but how do you see the role of private capital in creating new 15-minute towns? So you referenced garden cities. Is that somewhere where there's some potential for the private sector to have a positive influence, sort of almost starting from scratch?
There is absolutely potential, and one hopes that new settlements or new suburbs or sustainable extensions or all those things should be built in such a way that they can become 15-minute neighbourhoods in the future. It isn't happening at the moment. I'm just about to produce a book on it's called The High Street, but it's been looking at retail centres. We looked at all sorts of settlements, and one of them, for example, was Cambourne in Cambridge, where there's a beautiful master plan done in the early 90s by Terry Farrell, 3 neighbourhoods with a town centre and a high street, and the high street never got built. And it never got built because the Morrisons got built, essentially. And it never got built when you talk to people, because the economic model for building that high street just didn't support building a high street. Even with 6,000 homes within a 10-minute walk of that high street, it didn't get built. If you go to Nansleden in St Austell, you've got a 400 home scheme there with a high street of 40 shops already built, and that is because it's a completely different economic model. They've treated the retail space as a service as opposed to a piece of capital which needs to get a financial return. They've let those spaces to businesses at low rents initially to allow them to become established, and then they've taken rents, and as the community's built up, that high street has developed. We need to really move to that type of model to see these local services as a service, as opposed to a piece of capital that needs to make a financial return. In Cambourne, if you didn't have Starbucks, you couldn't have a cafe, because Starbucks was the only people who could have created the return required to make that development viable. That isn't going to create 15-minute neighbourhoods. If we do that, we'll only get big national firms and supermarkets. And supermarkets, by definition, can't be 15 minutes because you can't have that many supermarkets which are 15 minutes walk apart. They have to be car-based. We need to find a way of allowing us to reinvent the high street and create local shops and facilities and so on. And that isn't just us wishing that. We need to create an economic model to allow that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. Rebecca, do you want to talk about any of that around obviously you've been dealing with, I'm assuming, at government level in Scotland and then maybe local authorities, but do you see potential for private investment to make a big difference here?
Yeah, I think that with the current situation that we're in and probably where we're going of reduced government investment or a really reduced local authority budgets, I think the private sector is going to be essential to unlocking this way of living. And I think that's about if it's a developer, understanding why this is a really good outcome. In other work, I've been working a lot with kind of build to rent developers, and for them the economic model is about people staying in their homes and feeling happy in their homes and having less kind of complaints about their homes, but also potentially for really large build to rent developers, potentially moving from one rental flat, maybe when they're a young professional, and then potentially moving into another rental situation if they have a family, and then maybe downsizing. That's a model that those developers might be looking at. They understand that place is a really important aspect of keeping those people happy. So, I think when you look at it from that kind of other economic side, which might be a developer coming into this space, keeping this is something that we know creates great places, and that's a real driver of people wanting to stay in these places.
Okay.
Sounds like they actually got slightly higher values for the houses because the high street was there, so you get an economic return.
Yeah, so there are questions coming in around and about how you stop this becoming a sort of gentrification issue. So one question here, talking specifically around London, it's saying haven't the better off always had 15-minute cities? Think of London. It's not a city, but it's a collection of villages. The better off, more expensive areas are all 15-minute neighborhoods if you look at London. And then so I guess that's the challenge, isn't it, with this concept, is that we can see where it works. It's hard to make it work where it isn't working. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of, I think what you're saying as well, political will to make it happen, to think through business models and incentives, and think of local high streets as services rather than just straightforward, it's a pure business play. Is that really what you're saying, David?
That is pretty much what I'm saying. Yeah, and I worry when particularly low traffic neighbourhoods become sort of making an area more exclusive than it is at the moment, because no one goes through it who doesn't live in it anymore. Again, I did a piece in BD a while ago. In my early career, I used to be the planner for Moss Side in Manchester, and Moss Side had been done in the terraced area of Moss Side. The old bit had been done in the 70s by traffic engineers, so there was no true through traffic. They turned it into a low traffic neighbourhood, particularly, and it was a disaster. It became a ghetto as a result. And one of the things I did when I was a planner, and this is back a long time ago, is I opened up all the streets again and allowed all the traffic through. So I reversed a low traffic neighbourhood, and it was one of the things that really allowed that area to come back to life, because it no longer felt like a cut off ghetto part of the city, but somewhere that all sorts of people went through, and there was through traffic, and there wasn't a lot of rat running really went on in the area. And so I'm suspicious, because actually I've been, again, comparing against cul-de-sac based estates for ages, and low traffic neighbourhoods in a sense, a cul-de-sac, and turning normal areas into cul-de-sac based estates. And I think one needs to worry about that, because as an urban designer, permeability has always been an important issue. And whilst we have a big debate about does permeability always have to relate to cars, and it probably doesn't, there is something about an area where you have no through traffic that does become slightly exclusive. In affluent areas, that obviously leads to gentrification. In poor areas, it leads to ghettoization. So I think one needs to be very careful about these things, and that is a point that I've been trying to make for some time.
I suppose just to play devil's advocate there, that there still is, an overwhelming need to reduce car usage generally, to hit net zero targets, just to reduce pollution in highly urbanized areas. Active travel, there's lots of data to suggest how good it is for people's health if we can get people moving. A lot of car journeys probably are unnecessary and are maybe just habit forming. So I guess it's around getting the balance right and working out how to bring communities with you and not exclude people whilst you're trying to do the right thing. Is that fair? Is that fair comment, Rebecca?
The research does show that the car use within LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, is reduced, and so yes, I accept that point. On cul-de-sac-based estates built by house builders, obviously it increases car ownership because it makes walkability more difficult. So I think it's the jury's out on those things. Sorry to.
No,
Yeah,
no,
sorry.
I think then that comes back to that importance of that really strategic approach, because, you know, we're talking about this risk of ghettoization or gentrification in individual neighborhoods. What we've got to understand is the city is a fabric, and that we're drawing these boundaries. These boundaries don't exist in real life. You know, people don't experience the city in a ward boundary or a borough boundary or an LSOA, you know, a tiny boundary. They experience the city as a fabric of place, and we can draw boundaries wherever we want to. But the idea, you know, what we've got to get back to is those outcomes that we want to drive, and we want to drive forward, and then a better experience of place. So if we take this strategic view and go, what do we want to drive for the whole city and the whole place and the whole system, and then where do we intervene in the gaps that we have, then, you know, I think we're able to look at across a much bigger picture, and balance. And it's going to be about trade-offs. Always, this is going to be about trade-offs. These are hard decisions, but ultimately, if we're able to look at the impacts, I think we can take a much much broader approach.
That's a great note to end on. I'm afraid we've reached the hour, but I mean, there's so much to talk about. I don't think this is going to be the last time we're going to be talking about 15-minute cities. Thank you so much, both of you, for your really interesting insights into this. It's a really complex area, and I'm really pleased we've been able to dive in and get beyond some of the polarized debates to actually talk about, you know, some of the real issues. So this is all about this webinar was all part of Social Value Live. We've got another session at 2 p.m. today if you're interested in coming back. That is about another really interesting topic, designing and delivering neurodivergent friendly places. So I'd really be interested in listening in on that one. And there's another session at 11 a.m. tomorrow and 2 p.m. tomorrow about delivering social value through construction projects. So that's all we've got time for today. You can get all of this on demand. Hopefully we'll have David's presentation for you available as well. So that's it from us. Thank you so much, Rebecca and David, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.